specific, and they tend to be things like, their husband. A lot of these cases that I refer to, they have husbands who are men of the sea. They're sailors, and they're trying to secure their fidelity, either if it's in a near-term context or a long-term context. They're trying to protect against adulterous men, abusive men, in a lot of cases. Sometimes I think in general, though, what we could say is that they're trying to express, and this is what other people have argued when they look at these kinds of cases in the New Spanish context, is that they're trying to express a certain modicum amount of control over their social world, which is kind of defined by a repressive state, one in which they have less power. Men are very mobile. So I think that there's an aspect of, I wouldn't call it resistance. I think there are aspects of resistance, but what I'm talking about is more defining ways in which these women or their clients can find ways to control aspects of their social life and their relationships with men in particular. So that's an overriding theme. But the reason I kind of focus away from that and away from resistance and away from correlation and syncretism is because what I'm really interested in is understanding how relationships between different colonial spaces influence the way people can, share ideas, can create networks, can navigate spaces between empire and multi-centric spaces, right? So that's kind of why I focused away from it. But I think that is a real, I think that is the motivation of the clients in general.
Thank you. Chris Poole is next. You got to unmute.
There I am. Hey, Joe, this is great. I work in a part of Veracruz that's famous for its brujos.
Catemaco?
Well, around Catemaco, all of the toothless. And I was also struck while reading this, not only kind of the similarity of some of the practices of, I think La Isleña or whatever her name was, but with theirs, but also there's, a prominent volcanic peak in the toothless called Santa Marta. So just kind of thinking about connections here, I wonder if, the brujos practices in most of the ethnographies, the couple that there are usually traced to pre-Columbian practice. And even though there's a strong African component kind of in the region generally. So I'm just wondering if you found any historical connections there.
To pre-Columbian practices particularly?
Well, either a syncretism in the practices of the Afro-Caribbean groups with pre-Columbian practices, or just a historical kind of movement into the toothless.
Yeah. So I think actually it's been harder for me to trace syncretisms or pre-Columbian cognates than it has been to trace particular African cognates of some of the practices. There are, of course, plants and things that come up. They don't come up as much in some of the things that I'm reading. So I've also included information from secondary sources of people who worked on similar cases, and I don't see as many herbs or anything like that, for instance. But that sort of material can be really helpful for that in particular. So the way that it's kind of characterized in the cases that I read, or I see a lot of precedents in European folk beliefs and in African folk beliefs. And I do think that there is a moment, and there is kind of an active moment in which in Veracruz, and this is kind of, it's not my argument, but it's informing my argument, that it's kind of cataloged or indexed as a space. The port itself is cataloged or indexed as a space that is heavily Afro-descended, and therefore that is the way that people understand the practices. That's the lens through which people are understanding these practices. It's interesting, the Santa Marta Peak I didn't know about that in particular. But, you know, when you're looking for Santa Marta cases in Colombia, in Cartagena, of course, it's very difficult because there's a whole department there's a city of Santa Marta on the coast there as well. So I think there are ways, if I moved into the interior, there are other cases of Santa Marta worship in particular. For instance, later in the 17th century in Puebla, there are similarities in some of these cases in other parts of Mexico at different times. So I think there are probably lots of ways of tracing links and linkages. I guess my argument has been that I'm not kind of describing a self-contained world, but one that is particular to a time and place, which is Veracruz in this early 17th century moment, and then kind of seeing the diachronic evolution of it up to a point. And it's influenced by connections, not just within the Caribbean, but into the interior of Veracruz and into the interior of Mexico, and then obviously across the Atlantic world. But for me and the people who are living in Veracruz in this time and place, the connections that are most salient and help us to understand the ways that they're navigating their social world are those in the Caribbean. So that I guess that's my answer.
Thanks.
Does that answer it? I don't know. Does it answer it?
Yeah, it certainly addresses it. Yeah. So thank you.
All right. Thank you. Next is Francie.
Unmute. Okay. Well, this is fascinating read, and I admire you because I know what it means to work in the Inquisition archives, and you have to have tremendous patience, and that's why I never studied paleography. So for other people, I mean, this has required hours and hours of really concentration and hard work. So kudos to Joe for that. But I'm going to play devil's advocate. Okay. I have a whole bunch of comments, and probably we should talk about it separately, right? And but I'm having trouble with the borderland idea, that concept.
Okay.
I think that you've put blinders on. Your Caribbean perspective has given you some blinders to not see Veracruz's connection with the rest of Mexico and what's going on. Veracruz is such a nodal part of this circuit with the Caribbean, with Spain, but with the interior. It is the place that connects with the interior of Mexico. And you define, let me find this, it's hard to do this when you're, got all these things. You define borderland as a space where one jurisdiction ends and another begins, where the structure of power shifts from one spatial arrangement to another. For Ana Maria Juana Gutierrez and those they mentioned in their testimony, the Caribbean world was this place where bordering power structures could be negotiated and manipulated. Well, I think that describes Veracruz well, but not as a borderland, right? I would suggest Mary Louise Pratt's concept of contact zone. To me, it seems like the perfect contact zone where all these things are coming together and mixing. And Veracruz is that place, that contact zone where it's spreading out to because you mentioned that they end up in Huejotzingo and Cholula. That's way in the interior of Mexico, right? So the idea of border in there is, to me, it's the contrary. It's a space where things are emanating out of and moving into the interior. And I would mention, like Chris did, Catemaco, which is famous for its brujeria, but I would mention the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which had a very large Afro population right at this time of the slaves that were people enslaved, people who were brought in, and is a famous center of healers and brujerias. And when I read The Egg, it just hit a nerve because I know all about the use of the eggs, and all the things that you're describing are very familiar to me of the healers and the curanderas that work on the isthmus. So I'm assuming they had to come through Veracruz at that point, almost, at least a lot of people had to come. So I see it as it moving out to the rest of Mexico and not so much as a border space, but.
That's a good point. I mean, I have to take another look at Mary Louise Pratt in particular, because I think, so I've kind of used this concept of borderland. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But first, I guess I'll go back to addressing your kind of first point, which is about how the connections to the interior are really, really important. And I don't disagree with that at all. My argument, and this goes kind of for the entire project, not just through this chapter, is basically that there is this other, the Caribbean perspective represents another lens through which to understand people in Veracruz in particular, and that it hasn't been applied as much as it could be. That if we read a lot of these kinds of cases through the Caribbean lens, we would see connections, we would see patterns that we don't see when applying the lens primarily of New Spain and Mexico, which is kind of what I argue a lot of people have done.
That's your contribution. I get it. You know, it's really important.
But I mean, like, I think the real, like, and we can talk about it later, or you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the real heart of the point you're making goes to the border itself, right? And because you're right, that it is this place where it's a port city, so it's linking land and sea, and things are filtering through it into the interior. And a lot of times in some of these cases, there are well, the case of Maria Jarama in particular, I mean, she's arrested in Mexico City. A lot of the people who testify against her, the first people who testify against her are from Veracruz, but a lot of the people who ultimately do are also from Mexico City or Puebla or Apicazo. So they're from central Mexico. So those are important connections. And that's something, I think it's a weakness of the book in general, to be completely honest, that I have kind of like, I have put blinders on, right? I've been very, very focused on showing the ways in which the Caribbean becomes really important. And maybe it would do the work more credit if I argued or made the extended argument that the Caribbean can be filtered further into the mainland too. So not just that we should read cases in Veracruz through this Caribbean lens, but we should kind of try to understand all of Mexico or all of New Spain, or at least parts of it, through a Caribbean lens.
There's also this population in Guerrero too. That's
yeah. So I mean,
Costa Chica, Oaxaca, right?
So the thing, that's right. Well, that's true. I mean, Costa Chica. Well, so the thing, what it ultimately comes down to is that I want to see, or I think, this is what I would argue, that while there are ways that we could reach the Caribbean and the Afro-Atlantic and all these other like spatial arrangements into parts of Mexico that we haven't quite done yet, that for Afro-descendant people in Veracruz, particularly in the port, but in the coastal region especially, because those connections to the Caribbean are so much more immediate, and connection to other spaces of African diaspora spread throughout the Caribbean across different colonial jurisdictions, because they're so accessible, that they have opportunities and ways of defining relationships to the state, of defining identities, of all sorts of doing all sorts of things that people in other regions don't have as ready access to. And so while I think that there are ways that we could kind of read into interior Mexico Caribbean relationships, or some of the things that I'm talking about, or see similarities, that they exist in a very particular way in Veracruz. And that maybe isn't as strong of a point for some of the cases that I'm looking at in this chapter. I think it's stronger for some cases that I look at elsewhere, where we have people, making petitions, free Black militiamen making petitions about why they have a certain role or should be excluded from paying free Black tribute because of the relationships in the Caribbean and things like that, because free Black militiamen in Havana and Campeche and Santo Domingo.
I don't want to monopolize, but just one more thought, and that is, if what you're saying, you could argue the same thing for Cartagena, that Cartagena's acting in the same way that Veracruz for the interior of Colombia.
Yeah, well, I think actually in some ways you might be able to argue it more strongly, just because Bogota is so much more difficult to access, over land than Mexico City, which is still, it takes as much time to go from Mexico City to Veracruz over land as it takes to go from Veracruz to Havana, right? Or is Havana, you can even go quicker in a lot of cases, depending on how you're traveling. But for Cartagena, the trek to get to Bogota is even more arduous. You have the Magdalena River, but it's a similar case. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Next
Thank
we
you
have.
for the
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was just saying thank you, and that I'd like to talk more about it.
Absolutely. Next is Abigail.
This is just wonderful, exciting work, Joe, and it was so much fun to read. And of course, as everyone knows, I know nothing about the region. So I will be saying things that are really, really silly. And I can only hope that having to explain them to someone who knows nothing will be helpful. But I'd like to follow up on some of the points that Francie was making, and also to go back to some of the questions people have been asking about the economy of these practices. So one of my first, I suppose, suggestions about something that you may have in an earlier part of the book is, at any point, do you tell readers what the gender proportions in the population of Veracruz are? I just remember being thunderstruck when I found out that some of these early modern cities are not the sort of gender balanced cities that we take for granted. And early modern Rome was something like 80% male, which meant that female labor was often trekking in from the neighboring villages. And so I'm really interested about more details about the actual urban configuration of Veracruz, because I think that that may help us get at some of the relationships that Francie's asking for and that you're also trying to define about that borderland. Is what kind of interactions are you seeing between the immediate sort of urban port core of Veracruz and the people flowing in and out to the neighboring regions, which may have higher indigenous stable populations rather than those transient Caribbean populations. And one reason I'm setting that as a framework is that I don't know if it's possible. I don't know these Inquisition records. And different inquisitors take different keep different kinds of records. But as you know, and most of the people here know, Inquisition records are also really interesting because of their indications of social frictions, right? You've got to have the people bringing the accusations or agreeing to come forward and gang up on the accused effectively. And another thing I thought, and maybe I missed it, was I wondered whether these records, if you have enough of them, and whether you can tell enough about the people who were giving the depositions to see if you've got a little bit of an insider or outsider thing going on here, and if in fact some of these religious practices, either for social reasons or economic reasons or religious reasons or all three, are actually showing some kind of competition. And this is probably a real flight of fancy, but I got interested in the commodities that some of the practitioners were using, and the ones that specifically you traced back to Africa. And you also talked about the availability of mercury or something. And I was thinking, these women may not just have all this stuff lying around. And it sounds like you've already picked up on the fact that the Inquisition records aren't reporting as much about practices that are more local or more traditional or involve more of the local substances. So I wondered if the substances themselves start to give you a picture. First of all, if this is a business for these practitioners, are the women who are using the long distance, more exotic substances, are they charging more for their services? How are they obtaining those substances? You know, are they asking the sailors? And it sounds like these are small objects. So even when the ships are searched, you know, you might be able, if you were a sailor, to, you know, put a few little bones or something in your pocket. And is there a black market trade in this stuff? So if you can sort of take that jumble of questions and put it together into a response, anyway, you can just see how excited I am about everything you're doing.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I can try. I can certainly respond to some of those things for sure. In terms of the gender proportions, just to start with that, I don't have a reliable way to gauge that. Basically, there are census records. The most relevant ones are in 1680, but they don't report gender balances in the major report. So when they took the census, there would be what are called padrones, which are kind of individual level, like, you know, asking every person to identify themselves. And then they're kind of compiled into broader reports of the diocese itself, in this case, the Tlaxcala diocese. I don't have padrones for Veracruz as the port city. They presumably exist or existed somewhere. I found padrones for 3 outlying towns. And I have in the previous chapter, I analyzed those census records, and I don't know off the top of my head what the gender distribution was, although there's a table in that chapter that shows. What they do show is that it is that space is heavily Afro-descended, and other records that I've looked at have suggested it. However, the outlying towns are less, I kind of expected them to have more indigenous representation, and there was less than I expected. So even in those outlying towns, it was 8 to 10% indigenous compared to about 60 to 70% Afro-descended. So those are just 3 towns, right? In terms of the gender balance in the city itself, while I can't answer specifically, just anecdotally based on the things that I've read, I have the strong sense that there is a large transient male population that is mostly sailors, especially in certain times of the year because of the way that the transatlantic trade worked. It was very seasonal. And so there would be times of year when there would be, you know, up to 1,000 sailors coming into port at the same time. But other than that, the local economy is predicated almost entirely on service economy. You know, outlying towns have small scale agriculture and cattle ranching. There's a lot of cattle ranching on the outside of the town. But in the city itself, like in between the walls, is very much service economy oriented. Even the warehouses, there are some warehouses on the city to keep goods while waiting for ships to come and go and things like that. But even warehouses are often more into the interior, which was something they did specifically because they're worried about pirate raids and things like that. So it is, I think it does have, in terms of its resident population, stable population, my guess would be that it leans heavily female. And that's represented in a lot of the cases that I read like these. But also in other things I've looked at, like hospital admissions records, for instance, and things like that that show far more female patients than male. But that could also be for other reasons, right? So I haven't made firm. Do you have you want to?
Yeah, one of our graduate students some years ago did a dissertation on Inquisition records and space in Venice. And what she was able to find were patterns in female controlled spaces, because the female workers would reside in rooming houses altogether. So there were these neighborhoods with concentrations of women, and also it was a control of a particular kind of domestic space. And some of the condemned practices were taking place in those neighborhoods and in those controlled spaces. So just kind of an addendum to where you're going with this.
Yeah, so I think that, I haven't done that kind of analysis, but just speaking completely off the top of my head, a lot of these cases involve women who live in the same domestic spaces with one another, in guest houses or just in the same spaces. So I see that as a pattern. And that's also true of the cases in Cartagena as well that I've read in the secondary literature. I think there's similarities there. The competition, that's a great question. The potential competition between practitioners, or patterns of how foreign, whether or not, foreign objects or potentially practitioners who are seen as more exotic or foreign are coming before the Inquisition more regularly. That's a fantastic question that I should incorporate more of that kind of thinking in the paper, I think. So the one case in which it would be really easy to kind of read that in would be the case of Ana Maria Vasquez and Juana Gutierrez, which is kind of the last that I consider. That case is provoked by the denunciation of Ana Maria Vasquez, who is not a native of Veracruz. She is the outsider, very much so. And it turns out to be a case of false testimony, and Juana Gutierrez is a longtime resident. She was born in Jalapa, or outside of Jalapa on a sugar plantation, and a longtime resident of the port when she's denounced. And it's a really interesting case. And like I said, kind of briefly in the introduction, there are 5 different Inquisition cases that are connected to it, at least 5 that I know about. And I've seen 2 of the 5. And then 2 other people have worked on 2 others of those, so I've read their work. And there's a lot of conflict because it's a case of false testimony, and in different people's testimony, it's really unclear to me exactly what some of the relationships were. So she denounces, for instance, Juana Gutierrez, but then in the case of Juana Gutierrez, the Inquisitor says that she wasn't even able to identify or describe Juana Gutierrez's physical appearance. So like, she obviously knew who she was, or else she couldn't have denounced her. But she's the outsider. But the Inquisitor finds in the favor of the women who are local and against the outsider. So it's a case of false testimony. The other women are released. The woman who is accused of false testimony, the outsider, is sentenced to 200 lashes in the public square. So, wow. There is this kind of like fallout of that case against the outsider. And yeah, so I think there is potentially something there. I would love to be able to see those other cases, which might help me in some ways, but there are limitations in what I'm able to do with Inquisition records.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think this discussion is really stimulating on many different fronts. And the next question goes to Jeremy.
Thank you. I agree. This is very interesting material. I want to go back to some of the earlier discussion about the Inquisition and the poor inquisitors who seem to be in the position of the people nowadays who believe in the QAnon conspiracy theory. They think there are satanic conspiracies going on all around them. And you mentioned briefly in the paper the issue of looking for Judaizers in the Spanish Empire. And is that one of the things that the legacy of the attempt to wipe out the practice of Judaism in the Spanish Empire and the conviction that the inquisitors have that there are nevertheless Judaizers everywhere? And we know in Spain they can't even trust each other because some of them are accused of, Judaizing even while they are officials of the Inquisition. Does that contribute to an atmosphere in which they are convinced that there are sort of heterodox practices going on everywhere? And does that help explain the extraordinary effort they put into? I mean, you say they hold some of these investigations go on for years, you know, which is a remarkable investment of effort in trying to determine exactly what these suspects are doing and why.
Yeah, it is really, and it is, I will say it's typical of the Mexican Inquisition in particular, probably of other inquisitions, so I'm less familiar, that these cases do go on for such a long period of time.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I was going to say our former colleague Gretchen Starr-Lebeau, who worked on cases in Spain, you know, they drag on for years and years.
Yeah. In fact, the case of Ana Maria Vasquez and Juana Gutierrez is relatively short by comparison to other Inquisition cases. And then there's those like Maria de Rojas that I only have the 5-folio. It's in a file, a section of the archive that is labeled miscellaneous because it's not with the rest of the case.
Yeah.
But it could have gone on for a long time, for as long as I know, as far as I know. But so, and I think that what we see across these, whether it's Judaizing cases or these cases of witchcraft and sorcery, is that there is, I don't want to call it legitimate, but there is a fear that heterodoxy is, or orthodoxy really, is so entwined with the Spanish state or the state of the colonies that, you know, religious belief and kind of, I'm searching for the right words, that adherence to certain religious norms is necessary for the proper functioning of society in very real terms. And so there are other ways in which I talk about in other parts of the book, an anxiety about religious deviancy or just failure to uphold certain religious norms results in real world consequences in terms of disaster and fires and, you know, all sorts of things, ills, that yellow fever outbreaks that befall the city. And then also in a more active sense that there is, you know, kind of a militaristic, the idea of that Vanessa raised at the beginning of the borderland as battleground, I think is really present there, because this is post-Protestant Reformation, and there is a militaristic attitude about advancing and protecting a certain kind of Baroque Catholicism. And so there is that element. I think that they're entwined. I think that people who look at these cases and want to see, you know, the ways in which they're heavily political or politicized, or that they're about depriving propertied women of sources of income, or they're about, you know, disempowering Portuguese people after the Portuguese revolt in 1640 by accusing all the Portuguese people in the Spanish Empire of being crypto Jews. That there are political and material impetuses, but those are tightly braided with the spiritual impetus as well. That there is you know, that there is an anxiety about maintaining orthodoxy against an active foe, and protecting the true religion, right?
Thank you so much. Our next questioner, or inquisitor, is Phil. Sorry.
Well, Joe, I'll be the kindest inquisitor imaginable, because I really enjoyed your paper. I knew absolutely nothing about the content before I engaged with it, and that's always kind of fun, because to me it kind of privileges what your big takeaway is, right, as a completely ignorant person. And this goes back to the good-natured disagreement, maybe that's not really what it is, between you and Francie over Borderland. And I've been thinking about Borderlands ever since Francie's intervention, because like the big takeaway for me is that if I have my, like you kind of moved my Google map of like Southern North America, you kind of decentered it, right? Because before I read your paper, Veracruz would have been in the lower right-hand corner of that map. And And now I'm thinking about it in terms of the upper left-hand corner. And I'm wondering if that's kind of a metaphor that you might want to do something with, because of course, both you and Francie are right. You know, Veracruz functions in both of these ways. And so a borderland kind of works in both directions, and I know there's a big literature on borderlands that I'm really not familiar with. So I'm just kind of like talking through my hat here. But I'm wondering if there are other geographical metaphors that you might play with. And one of them would be the idea of a gate, like a gateway, which can go in two directions simultaneously. And in keeping with that idea, there's a quality of your work that I really like, and that it's really anti-binary. You know, you're about porousness, you're about flexibility, you're about not really being able to contain people or things in categories, and you know, and I think that's great. And so that kind of gives me the image of a gate that's partly open, and that you can't really shut, right? And that sort of gets into your final rift about Borderlands, about how the authorities would like to shut it in certain ways. They want to try to control the flow of ideas, the flow of people to a certain extent, and they can't do it. So maybe the gate has a lock on it that's broken. I mean, I don't know. But I would just encourage you to keep playing with some of these metaphors, because Borderlands, I think, work in some ways. But to me, it conjures up an image of something kind of hard and fixed. And almost everything about your paper is about squishy and not fixed. And to me, that's like a fundamental quality of the way you look at the world that I think you want to try to sort of italicize with your metaphors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think maybe it would be useful for me. I know Francie read that section where I do kind of try to define what I mean by borderland, but I think it might be useful for me to play with that definition a little bit more. And I'd be open to considering other metaphors to use. I borrowed the concept of borderland initially from a colleague of mine who works on Matamoros in northern Mexico, which is a port in northern Mexico on the near Texas, just across from Brownsville. And so that's like a borderland in multiple ways. And she uses this phrase, maritime borderland. Her name is Melissa Galvan, if you're interested in that work. It's great. I thought it was a useful concept for me because we're so accustomed in Mexican history, especially towards the end of the 17th century and starting the early 18th century, to orienting ourselves around borderlands. Like, it's such a defining theme. And it kind of sometimes has this feeling of borders that are kind of hard, hard borders, but they're constantly in this kind of negotiation. And there is a process that, so I think of them as distinct from frontiers. And I think of this as distinct from frontiers as well. I think that it's very much a borderland and not a frontier. And specifically because there's an attempt to enforce a certain spatial arrangement, or an attempt to enforce a certain jurisdiction that is being contested, which makes for partially open gates in some ways, but it's this kind of like ongoing effort, and that's what makes it to me to be a border, is that a border necessitates an ongoing attempt or acknowledgement of a place where jurisdiction is going to apply. And sometimes it does successfully in Veracruz, and sometimes maybe it doesn't. I don't know if that kind of gets to it, but yeah, Francie, did you want to hear?
No, I'm sorry. I'm apologizing because I just wrote I need to go. I have an appointment. I had changed to be able to be here today, but we can discuss this later. And
yeah, we'll have to.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
I just wanted to, I sort of laughed when I saw Abigail's last note, because I think that was part of my problem as well, is that, you know, is that Veracruz is like the port nature of Veracruz is something that I think you really kind of, again, you drove that home to me as somebody who's never thought about Veracruz like ever in my life until this morning, right? And so this idea of like planning, you know, and how port cities are like some of the most porous places imaginable, right? They're porous in just about every way.
Yeah, you know, I like that you know, started with the map metaphor too. There's a phrase that people use in this period sometimes called the Mexican archipelago, which is mostly, and it's the title of some maps, and it's the title of it's used in like sailing charts and things like that. But it's so hard to represent like Veracruz as part of this Caribbean space because of the physical distance, because there's not that immediate border. But I don't know, there's something about the borderland. I can see how it may need more qualification, what maritime border means as distinct from land-based borders. But I don't know, it made sense to me as a metaphor when I initially used it, but I can certainly try to clarify.
You know, I think it still works. I would just encourage you to think of other kind of spatial metaphors that you might play with, because a space can be so many things at the same time.
That's true. Yeah. That's true.
So because we've had such stimulating conversation, we're actually running slightly short on time. So what I'm going to do is there are 3 people who would like to ask questions. I'm going to take all 3 of those questions. So I don't know, Joe, if you want to take some notes or whatever, just to make sure you got them. But so the questions are going to come from Scott, Tim Manella, and Deirdre. And so Scott, you're first.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so first of all, I want to say to Jeremy, like they probably were Jews, those Portuguese guys. They certainly were probably new Christians, right? I mean, this is the big thing, and Joe, you know this, like the big part of the Portuguese that came into the Spanish Empire were in fact people fleeing from the Inquisition, which came later to Portugal, and that's a whole complicated thing. You should probably just want to make a little note that wasn't a crazy idea. You know, it's not a QAnon conspiracy. It might very well be true about those guys in Veracruz, that they were in fact a bunch of crypto Jews, or at least they had reason to believe that. But my main question was, what do you mean by Caribbean? You keep talking about this as Caribbean and putting this in the context of the Caribbean, and I wonder if you mean there's something specifically Caribbean about what's going on here, or if you're just using Caribbean as like a synonym for Atlantic world. So I was curious about if, you know, could you see this sort of anywhere in the Atlantic world where you have African people meeting the Inquisition, whether it's Brazil or you know, Seville, even like that? You know, you might find this anywhere. Is there something specifically Caribbean about this, or is this just what you mean by Caribbean is just like a gesture towards the broader Atlantic world, which and this particular arm of the Atlantic?
All right, thank you. Tim?
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed your paper, Joe, and I want to thank Karen and Emily for inviting me to these sessions. I really appreciate it. So Scott just asked a very similar question that I was going to ask. I was interested in the title of your work, and that it was about Veracruz and the Caribbean. And when I read this very stimulating chapter, I saw lots of things that lined up with how I perceive the Atlantic world framework. So, but I was very interested in how you classed it. You had the title of your book and you talked about Veracruz in the Caribbean. And so I was wondering whether this is this framework of a Caribbean world, or you just mentioned the Mexican archipelago, how, if at all, is that distinct from the Atlantic world? And is this kind of a newer conceptual framework and category that might do something, that might really add something to our understanding of this period to look at a Caribbean world rather than an Atlantic world?
All right, thank you so much. And Deirdre?
Hello. I don't know everybody here. I'm Deirdre Reber. I'm in Hispanic Studies. And Joe, I've loved this discussion, and I want to ask you what I hope may be a fun question from a completely different time and disciplinary perspective. So looking at 21st century cultural production in both Latin America and the United States, there's been this profusion of magic, especially to counter kind of white masculinist colonialist power. And so I've been trying to think of like what are the cultural genealogies of this? And then sort of putting that to one side, I've always thought of the Inquisition as an explanation for genealogies of repressive power. But my question, and listening to you, has been, suddenly I had this question, like, would it behoove a scholar interested in contemporary kind of claims on magic as a contestatory discourse, would it behoove such a person to consider the Inquisition as a kind of as a source of that? So, thank you.
So let me just clarify that one. So a source in what way do you mean?
In the sense that it can be in a kind of institutionalized discourse with a very cultural kind of profile that not only creates a profile of what is to be repressed and contained, but also what can be dissident.
Right, right.
In what can be rescued then later on for dissident use.
Right. Yeah. I think, yeah, actually, well, I don't know as much about some of the 21st century profusion of magic that you're talking about, but to the extent that I do, I think that it has been a source in some ways, very specifically. You know, it's from what I can tell just from doing my little like Google Scholar searches for certain terms and things, there are absolutely people who are, you know, drawing from some cases like these to try to build compendia of things that they can do today in the present that build power. And in some ways, those aren't things that I wouldn't necessarily describe as magic, but going back to one of the first questions about belief and practice, I might describe it as belief and practice in the way that people, for instance, kind of build Afro-diasporic religions today in the Caribbean and the United States, and sometimes in Mexico too. For instance, some of the things that came out of the case of Maria de Orojas, the assemblages, the material elements. I mean, if you search for those things, those terms together, the things that are going to pop up are cases in Miami and New York, like today, of people using mercury or OBA practitioners and Santeria practitioners, and things like Santa Marta. You know, I don't really go into this argument in the paper, but Santa Marta is broadly identified in African diasporic religion today as a cognate for the character Mami Wata, who is an important figure across multiple African diasporic religions. So I think that there are ways in which people do draw on both these, but also, you know, other kinds of cultural patrimony to create compendia of magical practices or beliefs or something. So yes, I do. To the other questions, Scott and Tim's questions, which I'll just kind of combine together since they're very similar. When I was writing the dissertation, I would have more forcefully rejected the idea that the Caribbean that I'm describing is actually just a cognate for the Atlantic. I had this idea at the time that the Atlantic world was had essentially morphed into a new way of talking about imperial history. And that the processes that were implicated in Atlantic history, or things that were meant to have been happening in Atlantic history, had kind of become, you know, this centralizing idea, or the centralizing process. So like that people who were involved in it, even if you started being more inclusive in what your idea of the Atlantic was, who was constructing the Atlantic, whether you were including African diasporans, indigenous people, whoever, that you were still kind of relating them into this dialectic that makes that leads to conflict between Europe and those people, and that they are ultimately subject to European colonialism in a particular way. And for me, what the Caribbean did, the work that the Caribbean was doing, and I think maybe less so now, but still is doing, is that it offers this kind of space that is decentralized, or I've more started thinking of it as multi-centric, that because it overlaps jurisdictions and amalgamates different colonial spaces together in what I think of as a border zone, that people can kind of mediate between, you know, local spaces and central spaces, but with multiple centers, so that they don't have to rely only on, you know, the caste categories or religious categories of the colony, and they don't have to only rely on what local conditions will allow, but they can actually build networks across space to define ideas of community that are not adherent to any particular. And so could we find that in the Atlantic? I think that there are people that that would argue that we could. But for me, the reason I turned towards the Caribbean is because the way that the Atlantic has been used so frequently in the literature has, to me, just become something different than that. And so I found it more relatable. Specifically to the Brazilian Inquisitions, I think there are differences there, or the Inquisition in Seville. Particularly in Brazil, that the Portuguese Inquisition was always, the tribunal was always based in Portugal. You know, so so different in the Spanish context, because there's a tribunal in Mexico City and Cartagena and Lima, that, you know, there could be investigations, inquisitorial investigations of people in Brazil, as we know, before they were brought to Portugal, but many of those cases ended up in Portugal. So that, I think that is somewhat of a distinction, just in terms of thinking about space. I think today I would say that the Caribbean is kind of a subset of the Atlantic, that it still retains very particular relationships, and those I detail in other parts of the book, because the trade relationships, the material relationships are so thick, so much more thick within the Caribbean, the Mexican Caribbean space, than they don't branch out as much into other parts of the Atlantic. I mean, there's a transatlantic slave trade and there's transatlantic trade, but they're very different in terms of what they symbolize for people on the ground. And I would talk more about that if we had more time, but that's how I would answer the question.
Thank you so much, Joe.
You're welcome.
So we have a couple minutes left. I thought maybe if there's not another burning question, we might let Vanessa, you know, Vanessa, did you want to follow up on anything? And then we'll let Joe have the last word.
I'm sure there's something that I didn't address from your opening comments.
Right. But if somebody has a question, we can kind of sneak them in before Vanessa. Okay. All right, Vanessa, go ahead.
Sure. So something I've been thinking about from the chapter as we've been discussing is the way that you go back to how each of these cases is defined and how the people involved in the cases are defined. That place, not necessarily origin, but sometimes sort of a travel patterns can be tracked through these cases. And so I have a couple of questions. One question has to do with the way the document is constructed. And one has to do with the kind of what you can derive from that. But so are people offering up locations like I'm from Havana, or I'm from, or I arrived in the city at this point in time on their own, or is this a question, you know, they're being asked, or is it just sort of a notation, you know, this individual's from here. So that's one question. But then the other question becomes, are you really talking about how these you know, can you talk about, right, what associations people make between these different nodes? it certainly seems like there are particular associations with Veracruz that if you say, you know, this is where I'm from, or this is where this event happened, then there are particular associations just with the city itself. So if you say Veracruz, people in this constellation of port cities, this constellation of cities in New Spain, there are certain associations that come with that. I also kind of wondered, you know, what is being communicated when someone says they're from Cuba? You know, why claim Cuba? Why identify someone who's a practitioner as, you know, from the continent of Africa, when certainly they would have had to have traveled to a bunch of other places. So I think, especially when it comes to these questions about, well, what metaphor are you going to use here? It seems that your subjects are telling you that there's significance in these pathways, at least, or there's significance in denoting a particular journeys or travel, portage between very specific places. And so I keep thinking about how these places pop up in the cases you give us, and I wonder if there might be something there, and if you could kind of come back and comment on that.
Yeah, that's a great question.
All right, Joe, you have a few minutes to sum. You have the last word here. A few minutes. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Is there a shot clock, or does he just?
No,
okay.
Just that I don't. I mean, you know, we don't have to end at 3:30 on the dot, but we should try to be close. Yeah.
We'll try to be close. So in terms of, you know, how they're telling me where they're coming from, it depends on the case particularly. But if I have the whole case, like the entire person's case, then one of the things the Inquisition asks for is called a discourse of your life, and then they relate it. And they typically, it follows a general structure, but it's like birth, baptism, godparents, you know, where you've lived, when you got married, where's your husband now, that sort of thing. Some of the cases, like the one with Maria de Rojas, it's entirely dependent on the denunciation. And then there are the cases like the false testimony of Ana Maria Vasquez, where she tells us that she comes from Havana. One of the other deponents, Adriana Ruiz, tells us that she comes from Cartagena and not from Havana. So there clearly is a meaning to those spaces. Ana Maria Vasquez and her denunciation specifies that these other women have been in Cartagena, which suggests to me that Cartagena is kind of associated as this place where witchcraft is happening and coming out of. The women in the Santa Marta cult, many of them are Afro-diasporans who are born or claim birth in southern Spain. And I think that is particular too, that there is some kind of, you know, status associated with being from southern Spain and being a practitioner of a particular kind of magic that is understood as, I don't know, more normative within Hispanic society. And maybe Havana has a metonym too. Like maybe it is conceived as more. I would hesitate to have a answer for that one because I haven't figured that one out exactly what it represents as neatly as maybe Cartagena and southern Spain. But that's you know, I think that's something I can emphasize more in the future of the paper. So yes.
All right. Any last thoughts, Joe? Any
last thoughts? Thank you. Thanks everyone for the many questions. You're giving me a lot to think about, and other ways of kind of presenting the paper, which is exactly what I was looking for because I'm working through these cases. The first time I've really put them all together in this way. So I'm trying to figure out the relationships and what they mean in the context of the project. And I feel like I have a lot of ammunition for doing that now. So thank you very much. And thank you, Vanessa, particularly for your comments. I got a lot of notes out of them. So.
Thank you so much to Vanessa and to Joe and to all who asked questions and participated in the discussion. I'm, thrilled with the, sort of the broad-ranging, wonderful discussion we had and look forward to many more in the future. Take care, everybody.